what I wanted to do as a teacher is what I wanted to do in writing books. What role did my hometown, my county, play in the great events of American history? So the latest book has to do, obviously, with San Luis Obispo County Aviators. And I want to start to introduce you to someone that I knew a long, long time ago. And he was a teacher at Arroyo Grande High School, if I can get this thing to work. There we go. Al Spierling. He was not just the auto shop teacher, he's really the founder of Arroyo Grande High School's excellent industrial arts program. So all the programs that we have today, ranging from AutoCAD to culinary arts, they have their origin with this man. Tremendously energetic and tremendously passionate about teaching auto shop. Many of Al's students have told me he was their favorite teacher in high school. If they were the kind of kid who might have gotten into trouble, he was the guy who kept them in school. And he was absolutely keen on passing on his enthusiasm for automobile mechanics to his students. And of course, like most of us at one time, Al was a high school student, but it was in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This is from the 1940 yearbook. There he is underneath the arrow in a senior class play. He was not a drama student, even then. This is his epitaph from his high school yearbook. Over a motor he will often pose, experimenting, tormenting, on through life he goes. So even at the age of 18, he already had that enthusiasm for mechanics that he would pass on to a couple of generations of Arroyo Grande High School students. So he was drafted, this is 1940, and in 1944, the Army Air Forces gave him not one engine, but 4 B-17 engines. He was a flight engineer in the 457, oh my goodness. I actually was in the middle of I'm sure it was a fascinating lecture about the 30 Years' War to my European history students when I heard a B-17 from 2 miles off. I ran outside in the middle of the lesson plan and was jumping up and down like an idiot, which is not unusual for me. And I said, it's a B-17, it's a B-17. And it was so exciting. I just love airplanes. This is another reason I wrote this book. This is 21-year-old Al Spierling. He was a flight engineer in the 457th Bomb Group, which meant that he was responsible for hydraulics, for the electrical system, obviously for the engines themselves, and most importantly for the crew members, because they were flying at 25,000 feet. Al kept the oxygen system going. So he sat right behind the pilot and co-pilot. His position was in the top turret, which is significant. So he was both a flight engineer and top turret gunner, twin 50 caliber machine guns. And on his lucky 13th mission, he was in an airplane called Georgia Peach. And there's the flight manifest that day, Al Spierling, TT, top turret gunner. And I say lucky because, of course, it wasn't. This almost happened to Georgia Peach. These are 2 B-17s in a horrific collision over their base in England. What happened is that the B-17 above Al's, above Georgia Peach, hit some prop wash and dropped like a proverbial stone. Al was in the top turret, looked up. He said later, I could count the rivets in its bomb bay doors. So the 2 planes very nearly ran into each other, just as those other 2 planes had. It was nearly a disaster. Somehow Peach made it to the target, dropped her bomb load, turned around and began to head back home. And of course, the day was not over. What I found in research is what airmen feared the most, and justifiably so, because they couldn't fight back, was flak, German explosive shells that were pre-fused to explode at a certain height and send shards of metal through the airplane. Well, the flak burst directly next to Al Spierling took out the 2 left engines, number 1 and number 2 engine. And Georgia Peach went from 25,000 feet over Berlin. By the time she hit the coast, she was at 500 feet and dropping. That's when the pilot called out, Al, for God's sake, do something. So Spierling had a hunch. He crawled beneath the pilots and co-pilot seats and into the opening that the flak burst had left. And there he found the 2 throttle cables to the number 1 and number 2 engines. They were severed, lying right there on the flight deck. And he did what any good mechanic would do in that situation. He yanked on them as hard as he could. And the engine started. And Peach made it home. This is a photograph from the American Air Museum of Britain of Georgia Peach that day. And you notice how close the collision was? There's her tail. She made it back to base thanks to Al Spierling. He was a smoker then, as many young men were. He said, when we landed, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the cellophane off my pack of Lucky Strikes. He would go on, as a result of that mission, to win a Distinguished Flying Cross, an Air Medal with oak leaf clusters. And of course, the best thing about Al Spierling, his students never knew any of this. He never talked about it. Thankfully, when he did, it was near the end of his life in a recorded interview with the Central Coast Veterans Museum. Just an extraordinary man. So sometimes our connections to history can be a lot closer than we think they are. Sometimes they're as close as Auto Shop right down the hall at a Rio Grande High School. I found out also, because I'm just thoroughly interested in the history of aviation, that our county's history is a very rich one. This is a photograph of the very first airplane flight over San Luis Obispo, July 4th, 1910. And it's being flown by Hillary Beechey. Hillary and Lincoln Beechey were the West Coast equivalent of the Wright brothers, down to the fact that, like the Wrights, they opened a bicycle shop. That's how they got their start. They were San Franciscans. Hillary had all of 7 months flying experience when he took that flight over San Luis Obispo that day. His brother, his younger brother rather, Lincoln, was the more glamorous of the pair, handsome, dashing. He seemed to have left a trail of engagement rings in his wake when he finally died in this crash in 1915. His monoplane crumpled in midair and plunged into San Francisco Bay in front of 30,000 horrified spectators. So it was a dangerous business. This is Harriet Quimby, who claimed to have been born in Rio Grande. She wasn't. She was born in Michigan. She also claimed to be 10 years younger than she actually was. But she was the first woman in the United States and only the second woman in the world to earn a pilot's license. And she became a sensation. First woman also to fly across the English Channel in April of 1912. Unfortunately for Harriet, she did it the day after Titanic foundered. So she wound up on page 48 of the New York Times, just a case of terrible timing. This is July 2015, and this is, July 1912, and this is Harriet Quimby's last flight. Her monoplane pitched through the passenger and Harriet into Boston Harbor, and both of them were killed on impact. So again, as frail as these airplanes looked, it was, again, a very, very dangerous business. Nonetheless, this is Glenmont. This is an airplane built in 1928 that looks suspiciously to me like the Spirit of St. Louis. If you remember, Lindbergh's flight was the year before. The significance of this airplane, it was the first airplane built by college students in the United States of America. And those students were Cal Poly students. So this was their Learn by Doing project. Poly's aeronautical engineering program became so distinguished that it attracted visitors from around the United States, including in June of 1936, Amelia Earhart, who flew into our little dirt airstrip at Clark Field. She always wanted to visit San Luis. She says, your town is so cute and closed in like, surrounded by those mountains, I always wanted to stop. She visited Poly's aeronautical engineering department, which she loved, except, of course, for one thing. She asked where the young women were. 13 months later, she and Fred Noonan would disappear over the South Pacific. The McChesney family owned the Royal Oaks Dairy in Corbett Canyon. Leroy is really kind of the father of local aviation. The McChesney boys would stop their dairy chores and look up. They were fascinated by the vultures we see so commonly over here and how effortlessly they drift on air currents. I think probably the McChesney boys' interest was heightened when this airplane accidentally landed in a pasture next door in 1922. They had somehow mistaken Corbett Canyon for Santa Maria. Nobody seems to be too upset by the whole thing. They seem pretty jolly. But the McChesneys absolutely fell in love with flying, to the point where when Leroy married, he built a glider in his living room, and his kids had to crawl under the fuselage to get from the living room to the kitchen. Fortunately, since he was a dairyman, in the kitchen there was a Golden State Creamery ice cream. So that kind of made up for the inconvenience of having a glider in the middle of your house. Leroy's brother is Jess, and he was a B-24 pilot with the 15th Air Force flying out of Italy, flew 35 combat missions, and to me, just as impressive, he flew 100 missions during the Berlin airlift after the war. So just an incredible family. We would get our local airport, which is now called McChesney Field. It would open in 1939. We had a little dirt strip called Clark Field off of Tank Farm Road. This was the only other airport. It was grass. And if you know that Camp San Luis Obispo, it's adjacent to the Officers Club. And the 40th Division wanted bigger facilities because war was approaching as the 1930s progressed, and they knew they would need something that would be able to accommodate military planes. So in 1939, our airport opened, and it was first managed by 3 graduates of Pauley's aeronautical engineering program, the Hoover brothers, Chris and Dave, and I'm proud to say the third is Earl Thompson. My father was Alex Madonna Construction's comptroller for 20 years. My very first airplane flight was my dad was bidding a job in Marysville, and Earl Thompson was the pilot. He was also the pilot for King Saud of Saudi Arabia. His wife, who was a Hoover, was a gifted and beloved musical teacher, and she taught music to some of King Saud's children. There were 56. Pauley pretty much shut down during World War II. It went down to about 80 civilian students. It was given over to the Navy as part of what was called the V5 program, which was a pre-flight training program. Young men who went to Pauley, and there were about 3,000 of them who went through the program during World War II, learned navigation, meteorology, of course, military etiquette and discipline, and I'm sure they all enjoyed their daily run up to the Pauley P and back. Kind of made up for it is that they got really cheap candy bars and stuff in Morro Bay at the naval station there, and the train was always available, so if they got a weekend pass, they could go to San Francisco or Los Angeles. But about 3,000 pre-flight cadets would go through this program. And this is on the site of today's Hancock College. In World War II, it was Hancock Field. And about 9,000 Army Air Forces cadets went through their primary training, the first step in flight training, at Hancock Field. And this is a cartoon, I love this cartoon. He's having a little trouble with navigation. He's supposed to be over Los Olivos, but the last time I checked, there were no pyramids there. Here they are with their Stearman cadets, which were painted yellow and sometimes called the Yellow Peril, just both for the paint scheme and for the frequency with which they were crashed, which was an immediate ticket out of the program, whether you were dead or alive. This is from a yearbook, and this class produced many pilots, and one who did not make it as a pilot. He wound up being a bombardier in a B-24 in the Pacific. And of course, his name is Louis Zamperini, and he's the subject of Lauren Hillenbrand's wonderful book, Unbroken, a book I highly recommend, and even more, her book, Seabiscuit, which is absolutely marvelous. One of our most gifted writers. That same class produced 2 4-star generals in the post-war Air Force, 5 fighter aces during World War II. 7 members of this class participated in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April of 1942. That's one class. The B-17 is other than the P-51, is probably one of my favorite. If you ask me my all-time favorite, it would have to be Amelia Earhart's last airplane, that Lockheed Electra, which is just a gorgeous, gorgeous airplane, beautifully streamlined. The B-17 has some of those features, but many local flyers served as B-17 crewmen. This young man was an extraordinary young man. The Ballagh family is still in the area today. That's the 1916 version of the high school, which is on Crown Hill. And the one building that's still there from that high school is the Paulding Gym. And on December 8th, 1941, the student body of Rio Grande Union High School gathered in that gym to listen to Franklin Roosevelt call for a declaration of war on the radio. So he was the class valedictorian, and he would not do too shabbily afterward, thank you very much. He would wind up at Cal. There he is in the Cal yearbook on the far left. And while he was in Cal, everyone was sensing that something was approaching. He joined ROTC, and there's Clarence in that row there. He was on graduation. He was immediately commissioned. He wanted to be an aviator. So he was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Army Air Forces, went off to training where his life changed immediately and dramatically. He fell in love. And this is his marriage license to a fine Irish named Frances Marie Hogan in Braden County, Florida. They fell in love, and about a year later, they would have a little girl. But by that time, his stateside training was done, and he was at RAF Alconbury, a base in East Anglia. There's still some Quonset huts there today. I'm sad to say they tore down the control tower a couple of years ago, which I take issue with. He was to be a co-pilot in what was called a Pathfinder. And in place of the ball turret underneath the fuselage, there was a radar array. And the theory went, it didn't really work, the theory went that, as was so frequent in Northern Europe, the target was usually clouded over. The radar was supposed to be able to penetrate the target, locate it, and then the Pathfinders, which were in the van of the attacking squadron, would fire a flare to let the planes behind them know when the release point for their bomb loads were. Clarence didn't make it that far. 3 weeks before his first combat mission, he just was hitching a ride. My father was stationed in the UK during World War II. He got an award for meritorious drinking under fire when he refused to give up his seat in a pub during a V1 raid on London. And Edinburgh was by far his most favorite place. That's where Clarence was headed. He was merely hitching a ride on another B-17. The pilot ran into dirty weather. He was new to flying on instruments, and he flew the plane into the side of a mountain in the Lake District, Mount Skidder. And that's 5,000 miles away. Clarence would eventually be brought home to Rio Grande, but 5,000 miles away on the side of that mountain, there are still fragments from that B-17. When his body was repatriated, other items that came home to his wife was his wedding band. So we lost about 18 young men, pretty much half and half, about half through accidents, half in the course of combat, all the way from Papua New Guinea to France, Germany, even the Balkans. And of course the most famous is this young man here, another dairyman's son, that's Elwyn Righetti. It's one of the great mysteries of World War II. He was shot down over Riesa, Germany in April of 1945, just a few weeks before the war ended. He crashed landed his plane, radioed back to his squadron that he was okay, and was never seen again. And one of those deaths involved a young San Luis Obispo man. He's the smallest guy in the picture. Donal Laird then was the ball turret gunner, because they squeezed the little fellows into the ball turret, the motorized Sperry turret, underneath the fuselage. And the turret was so small that there wasn't room for the parachute. That was kept outside. Donal was killed on his first mission in that airplane, strictly GI, in January of 1945. But what's extraordinary is how his death reaches into our time. There's a German group dedicated to identifying remains or connecting the families of lost American airmen with their ancestors. And through a connection through one of my favorite websites, Ancestry.com, that German group located Donal Laird's family in San Luis Obispo. And 2 years ago, his watch was returned to his two nieces, who still live in San Luis. This is less depressing. It has a donkey. What's striking is we remember this as the greatest generation. That wasn't the case in between the wars. Intellectuals condemned the interwar generation as being frivolous, lightweights, easily distracted, and they would never amount to anything. Pretty much like what they said about my generation and what I've sometimes said about my son's generation. I think they turned out okay. We also have 2 test pilots, and if you've noticed already in the presentation, women's history has always been something that's very important to me, and women played a huge role in aviation during its development and during World War II. And one of those women is 99 years old, and she lives in Los Osos. She was one of over 1,000 WASPs, Women Air Force Service Pilots. And they did everything from towing targets for gunnery practice, which makes me nervous, thank you very much, to ferrying airplanes from factory to air bases, as Dorothy was, she was a test pilot, a special kind of test pilot. And her flight training was at Avenger Field, Texas, which is near Sweetwater, Texas, which Dorothy later assured interviewers, she said, Sweetwater, that's a misnomer. And the WASPs did the same basic training, including PT, that their male equivalents did. However, the uniforms fit the men just a little bit better. And Dorothy reported this too. There was intense hostility toward these women. Technically, they weren't in the military. They were civilian contractors, and that's an important point to remember because of how they were treated when they were killed. Dorothy said, though, she never experienced that hostility from anybody except superior officers. The young men that she flew with, the young men who themselves were learning to fly, always treated the women with immense respect. They remind me a little bit of Ginger Rogers, who once said, I did everything Fred did, except backwards and in heels. And she encountered that hostility at her first assignment, Williams Army Air Force Base in Arizona, where the base commander said, you will never fly for me. He was wrong. Her job was flying AT-6 Texans, an airplane that she absolutely grew to love. These were trainers, but she was a test pilot because what she was testing was to see whether the airplane had actually been fixed when it came out of the shop. Most of the time they were, but not always. She liked to take off because Arizona is so monstrously hot. She would go over the mountains and pine forests and let the wind blow through those big billowing coveralls that they wore. To cool off, she'd take the cockpit and push it back and just feel the wind. And then she was doing that one time when the engine quit and she began to drop. She went through her checklist, and this is something you hear with all pilots during World War II. In a situation like that, what immediately happens is that the training takes over. It's extraordinary. So she went through her checklist, which if you've ever seen a checklist for engine failure, it's immense. There's about 123 things for you to do. Meantime, the plane's dropping. And she began to ponder, should I jump? But for neither female nor male pilots had parachute training. And she knew that in a similar incident just a few weeks before, a WASP had been killed when she bailed out over the Mojave Desert. Her parachute opened, she hit the ground, and her open parachute dragged her to death over the rocks. Her name was Betty Pauline Stein, and she was from Santa Barbara. So Dorothy decided she was going to stay with her airplane. So she calmly went through her checklist a second time. There's only one difference, and I still don't know exactly why this happened. She hit the carburetor heater switch, which was an accessory meant for places like North Dakota. The engine started, and she made it home. Like many of these women did, she loved flying. Many of them would continue to be flyers after the war, but 38 WASPs were killed during World War II. This is Tommy Tompkins, who was ferrying a P-51D from Los Angeles to the East Coast. She took off and disappeared into thick fog over Santa Monica Bay, was never seen again. When a WASP died, since they were technically civilian contractors, the Army refused to pay for their burial. So Dorothy recalled the girls, which is what they called themselves in the 1940s, the girls would take up a collection to ship the body home, and one of the WASPs would accompany it. They were pretty much treated the same way in December of 1944. The program was suspended. Our personnel requirements were full. The war seemed to be nearing an end. So they were summarily fired and all sent home at their own expense. 32 years later, they were finally recognized as veterans through a bill that had the large part of the sponsorship came from another Air Force veteran, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. So he was the chief sponsor of this bill that finally recognized this generation of women as veterans. And of course today, look what happened. We have essentially their granddaughters. F-18 Navy pilot Tammy Jo Schultz, you may remember her engine blew up. And an extraordinary piece of flying. She brought her Southwest jet airliner home safely. We also have a man from Atascadero who was a test pilot for the Germans. His name is Harald Bauer. And he was a reluctant test pilot, not that he didn't love flying, because he did. And he said, I really would rather not fight the people of my mother's country. And of course, the Nazi government said, that's fine. We have camps for people like that. So he reluctantly became a test pilot, and maybe even more reluctantly when he found out his assigned airplane. He flew airplanes for the Heinkel factory, and his assigned airplane was a jet, the HE-162, the Volksjäger, the People's Fighter, which was made out of wood with a jet engine. And if you notice the placement of the jet engine directly behind the cockpit, if you got into trouble, tried to bail out, the engine would suck you into the intake. They were advised, oh, we'll come up with an ejection seat eventually, young men. If you run into any problem, just flip the plane upside down and jump out that way. Okay. Well, Harald was ferrying a Heinkel from the factory to an air base in Germany when an American B-17 squadron flew overhead and bombed the base. So he was ordered to skedaddle, get in his Heinkel, and take off to preserve it. And he was just about airborne. In fact, I believe he was airborne when he was bounced by a P-51 Mustang. And it sent bullets through the engine. One of them lodged in Harald Bauer's leg. This 17-year-old, the Heinkel, as you may guess, it had all the aerodynamic qualities of a brick, but he somehow managed to crash land it. And when he woke up, he was unconscious in terrible pain from his machine gun wound in his leg. And he looked up, and there's this monstrous American infantry sergeant standing over him, yelling to his friends, and, hey, this Kraut's still alive. So he happened to be from the 2nd Armored Division. They took Harald back to, there's some 2nd Armored boys there. They took him back and evacuated him to the medical tent where he was operated on. The surgeon presented him with a bullet he took out of his leg. They found out he was half American, spoke colloquial English, and they kind of adopted Harald Bauer, and he accompanied 2nd Armored on their push deeper into Germany. And here's a 2nd Armored tank right here. Well, in the path of 2nd Armored's advance was a beautiful little town called Kassel. And in Kassel, Germany, was the home of Harald Bauer's mother. So as they approached Kassel, they loaded him into an army ambulance, drove him to his mother's house, knocked on the door. She opened it, and they said, here's your son, ma'am. A wonderful story. Even more wonderful is Harald would become an American citizen, an AP reporter, and during the Korean War, he flew intelligence missions along the Soviet and Chinese borders with electronics arrayed airplanes. And he is an extraordinary gentleman and, of course, an extraordinary flyer. And by golly, I wish more stories were like that one. Thank you for coming today. Do you have any questions? Yeah.